All right, welcome to the lecture on Far Eastern temples. My name is obviously James Carroll, but this particular lecture, as you know, most of these came from a class I did at BYU. I taught a class on ancient religious worship, temples, that sort of thing. This one is based, however, when I got to Far East, there was a good friend of mine named Michael Lyon who was the expert. And I mean the expert. He knew more about this than anyone I really knew. And I always turned this lecture over to him. So I've stolen this one from his stuff. So when we do Egypt, Mesopotamia, that was me, and I knew what I was doing. And when we got to Far Eastern Temple, he did it. So I need to give him credit because about 90% of these slides are all stolen straight from his lecture. And because I called him when I prepared this and I said, help me figure out what some of these pictures are, because I don't remember. It's been years. And he helped me figure out what they are. And we wrote that down in my slide notes. And so I apologize. I'm also going to try to read stuff. Normally I just say it, and in this one I'm going to actually be reading some stuff. I also don't know how to pronounce Hindu words. Are like a nightmare for me. So I'm going to slaughter these words, and if anyone actually knows how to really pronounce, I apologize for the blasphemy I'm going to do. But I'll do my best to say these words right. But when you do temples, and that's what you talk about, the Far East is really where it's at. This is in Burma, Myanmar. But as you just look out over the countryside, there are more temples kind of per square foot than anywhere else in the world. It's just really a very beautiful sight. The Far East is the land of the temples. They built temples everywhere you look. And they're beautiful, beautiful buildings. My interest was in kind of the origin of religion. So for me, Egypt was exciting because 2000 BC was the date on 3000, some of these buildings. And the date is going to be, 600 AD, 700 AD. So they're late in comparison to what we've talked about up till this point. These are extraordinarily late structures. But they're beautiful and they're everywhere. And so you really can't, skip to the Far East when you want to talk about temples. The Far East, however, is a really diverse place. I mean, we've got Hindus, we've got Buddhists, there's this religion called the Jain, the Baha'i, the Sikh, there's Taoism and Taoism, and there's these Chinese, and I don't even know what to call these, and not just because this isn't my area, but because I don't know what to call them, even as I've read about them. There's these Chinese temples, and what are they? They're kind of emperor worship, or worship of the god of heaven, but I don't know if there's an organized religion today that we would call those temples, but they're Chinese temples. There's all these religious traditions, and they're all building temples, and they're all borrowing from each other, and they're all interrelated, and sometimes it's fuzzy. Where does Hinduism begin and Buddhism? Where does Buddhism begin and Hinduism end? It's not entirely clear. So it makes for a really complicated environment in which to discuss these things. Now, my first lecture I passed out, The Temple Typology by John Lundquist, which was essentially the Joseph Campbell version of temple building from the ancient world, right? But it was specifically tailored to the ancient Near East, and it had a list of things that all the temples in the ancient Near East have in common, kind of a comparative liturgy. John did that for his dissertation, and then about 20 years later, he published in what's called the Fundamentals of Temple Ideology from Eastern Traditions, where he essentially did the same thing. He repeated what he did for his dissertation, but for the Far East. So this is the same sort of thing. And you'll notice, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the hero with 1,000 faces approach to mythology. Let's see, what the heck is his name? I just said it a second ago. Joseph Campbell. So how many see that again? How many are familiar? So some of you aren't. Joseph Campbell did this thing with myths, where he said these are the things that kind of the ancient myths have in common. Well, that approach to the ancient world is enlightening, and it comes with a lot of problems. And the problems are if you think everything is a hammer, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And you start seeing these patterns everywhere. My favorite example of this is an article that was published, I think, in Newsweek or something. It was called Freud, Football, and the Dancing Virgins, where it essentially took John Lundquist's typology for the ancient Near East and applied it to football. Right? It was all there. Every single element was in football, right? And you could come up with some really complicated, deep symbology for moving the egg of summer over the white lines of winter to the dancing virgins. Right? And it's the funniest thing I've ever read, and it's great. And the more you do this, the funnier it becomes. But it is a real danger, and that is if you see these patterns, and if you start with these patterns, you see them everywhere. On the other hand, our human memory works by associating new information into some sort of a pattern that we've already established. And what these things do really well as an introduction to a topic is provide a pattern, an organization on which every new piece of information hangs. And so there's a lot of things that these things have in common. There's this preoccupation with priesthood authority, and even in modern Buddhism, a lot of the meditation masters will say something like, well, I learned from so-and-so who learned from so-and-so, my teacher was so-and-so, and therefore I could teach because I got the instruction. And it's really a technique for passing down the teachings pure. But they have a sense of authority and a sense of who taught me, who ordained me. So priesthood authority, there's this idea of emerging from the cave. This is very similar to Plato's allegory of the cave. There's an idea of a sacred center and a maze that you have to get to the center. The mandala, which we'll talk about in a bit, mantras, sacred mountains, mystery initiations, and sacred geometry involved in these mystery initiations. Specifically the square and the circle, which we'll get to, which is also part of the mandala. And then there's this idea that the teachings are secret, sacred, and only to be shared with the initiate. The one we want to focus on is the center. So we could call the Far Eastern temple topology this journey towards the sacred center. So as we do every element, we want to kind of think about how this relates to this idea of the sacred center. Try to tie everything to that, because that really is kind of the Far Eastern temple obsession. So if you think about the center of something, how do I draw the center? If you've ever seen engineering diagrams and they want to mark the center of something, it's actually kind of tricky, because if I put a dot, you'll notice in the center of the dot is something else, and in the center of that is, and no matter how far I zoom in, there's always something in the center of something else. In fact, the center is an infinitesimally small point, and it's actually impossible to represent, because you can't draw an infinitely small point, and if you could, you couldn't see it. So we represent the center by what is around it. And so that which surrounds the center points you at the center. And in the same way, this is a very meditative philosophy. That which we're trying to point ourselves at is this idea that is beyond anything we can describe. So when we talk about things, and Henry always gets mad at us in our Sangha for talking about stuff, conceptualizing, because the concepts aren't it. It is the center. The concepts are that which points you at the center. And if you get confused and start over-focusing on the concepts, you miss the center. So in both the philosophical argumentation and in the buildings, their purpose will be to point at this concept, which is the center, and everything around it points you at it, and then you have to approach it somehow. Because we want to depict the path the person takes to gain enlightenment or to gain that sacred center, that which is at the heart of all things, the center of all things. And so you have to approach it. And therein comes the cave. You're lost in the cave. You need to take the red pill, not the blue pill, right? This is the major. This is the idea of being lost, needing to be found, needing to wake up, needing to approach the center from being lost to being exalted or being enlightened. There's a path you walk. But there's this also idea that because you can never actually reach it, then you tend to circumambulate it, meaning to go around it in a circle, to surround the circle. So this is what we do in practice, in meditation. You look at it from this angle, then this angle, then this angle, and you go around that point at the center. So the buildings will actually be designed to let you go around the sacred center. And you do this from the east to the west by way of the south, at least if you're in the northern hemisphere, because the sun travels across the ecliptic to the south. And that makes your sundials move clockwise. So you circumambulate clockwise, and now you're representing not just your own motion around this sacred idea that you're trying to grasp, you're representing the cosmic connection as the stars wheel around the heavens and the sun wheels around the heavens, and you're now moving through the course that they travel and follow. And then, of course, you get to elaborate. Right? The more complicated this is, the more fun you can have with it. So now we have variations on the theme. You can approach, and then you can ambulate, or you can circumambulate, and each time you can enter little niches for certain rituals at each stop along the way. And there's as many variations on this theme as there are buildings. When we start showing you the buildings, you'll see the way they elaborate on it. But I'm going to take a divergence. Most of you know I used to be a Mormon, and so I'm going to show you a Mormon movie that they actually produced about temples, which is really a huge diversion from the ancient Near East. But I want to show you 5 minutes of this thing, and then we'll talk about the theme, because what they're about to show is going to be repeated in the Buddhist temples. We'll show you in just a minute. So it's just fascinating how this goes everywhere. You look, you see the same things happening. But this is a great depiction of what he's talking about. So the scene here, to set the scene, is the Mormons were being persecuted in Illinois and Missouri, and they were kicked out, and they traveled across the wilderness pulling hand carts and pushing wagons, and some of them were sick. And they just made it to the Salt Lake Valley, where they thought they would be left alone, because at the time Salt Lake in Utah was part of Mexico. So they escaped from the U.S. to Mexico, where they thought they would be left alone. Little did they know, the U.S. was about to take that land, and the Civil War was about to begin, and all sorts of problems. So for 5 minutes, let's watch this moment.
Many of us were ill with the mountain fever. Still, we desperately tried to plow America's land. The ground was so hard and dry, we broke several plows in our efforts. Hot, dry wind blew incessantly that day. I don't understand. This was the beginning? Yes. Toward the close of the day, Brigham thought we should continue our explorations of the new land of promise, despite it still being stricken with the people. I was an apostle by then. I felt we had found a land held in reserve by the hand of God. My soul was filled with the most sublime joy as we followed Brigham northward, right to the heart of the valley.
Brethren, here we will build the temple of our God.
Okay, so that's Wilford Woodruff. He ended up being the third, I think, president of the Mormon Church. But he was an apostle at this time, and he kept a journal. And so most of the lines from this movie were actually stolen straight out of his journal from what he wrote that day. And has anyone who here's been to Salt Lake City? I'm curious. Have you ever looked up an address in Salt Lake City? Have you ever played Battleship? D5, right? That's how addresses in Salt Lake City work. It's 3rd East and 5th North or something from Temple Square. And I get the vague impression that Brigham was just saying, we're going to build a temple in this valley, right? And he stuck his cane in the ground, and Wilford Woodruff thought, yep, we're going to build it right here. So he stuck his little stick, and he drove a stick into the ground. And if you go to Salt Lake City, every address you pick is measured from that stick, driven in the ground, which represents Brigham Young's cane plant, which says, here we're going to build a temple. So that moment is the building moment, and it's you plant the sacred center, and then everything revolves around that point from that moment on. That's where everything starts. This is a Brahmin priest. You can tell he's a Brahmin priest because he's got this white cord around his neck. This cord represents a robe that he was given on his second birth ceremony, where he was consecrated a priest. It represents his authority to preach and teach the teachings of Hinduism. And what he's building in the ground is this point. Here is the sacred spot. And he's making it out of sand on purpose, because it's unlike the Mormon temple. They were going to build it out of granite that stands to the millennium. And he's building it out of sand because everything in the world is impermanent. And tomorrow it will be washed away. So there's a difference in the philosophy. But there is a similarity in the concept of the sacred point, because he's sacralizing this spot for a temporary use as a ritual center. And then it will be washed away and it will go back to its normal function as a beach somewhere. And he's doing it by building this mound. And so this is a phallic symbol. You'll see it repeated. This is the male aspect and this is the female aspect. And you're putting them together to create the sacred Genesis point. And so it's not just a sacred center, it's also a sacred creative center, as symbolized by the creative power of the male and the female when put together. And the mountain, the mound is partly phallic, but it also represents the mountain of creation. We'll see this again when we talk about stupas. But it's a mountain that emerged from the waters of chaos that represents the founding of the world and the creation of the world. So, if anyone remembers Genesis chapter 1, you remember in the beginning there was darkness and void, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters, and he said, let there be light, and there was light. And then on the next day he says, let the dry land appear, and the water recedes. So we start out with this water. Everything is made out of water, and the sky is blue because it's made out of water. And God stands in the midst of the waters and says, let there be light. And light appears in the midst of the waters, and then the waters recede and the dry land appears. And when the dry land appears, it appears as a mountain. So some of you saw my Egyptian lecture. This should sound really familiar. There's this Egyptian myth, remember, about this mountain that appears when the waters recede, and this falcon flies down and picks up a stick and flies over the mountain and plots the stick down and sets it up as a sacred standard. And then the falcon lands on the standard. And from that moment on, Egyptian temples are marked by flags that are built on top of little mounds. And the mounds represent the mountain of creation. So if you remember in the Bible, in Noah's Ark, remember it lands on Mount Ararat. So the entire world is flooded according to the story, and Noah sails across his boat, and this time it's a dove instead of a falcon, returns with an olive branch, telling him that this is the same stick that the falcon picked up, right? Telling him that the dry land is back. The ark sticks on the top of Mount Ararat. The waters recede, and Noah comes out and plants a vineyard and gets drunk, and then the story moves on. but that moment is repeated, and this is what I find fascinating: is the way these themes show up over and over again in tradition after tradition, from thousands of years apart. And they're all drawing, depicting, representing the same thing over and over and over again. So this is the moment of creation. So Hindu temples. There's a lot of different traditions. We'll just start with Hinduism, then we'll go to Buddhism, and then we'll probably be out of time. But if there was time, we could do Baha'i and Jain and all sorts of fun stuff. But let's do the two big ones, the Hindu and Buddhism. And before I show you the buildings, this is a class on temples, not an overview of Hinduism, but we need at least the basic. So, knowing very little about Hinduism, here's my attempt to overview what Hindu religion is. They have some beliefs, they have some practices, and then they have this philosophy of the objective of life. And in most of these traditions, the practices and the philosophy is more important than the belief. The belief exists, but the belief is almost secondary, and it's something you can abandon at will. But the practices and the philosophy is what it's really all about. So the beliefs are reincarnation, right? That we lived before, we're going to live again. Karma, which is this idea that life looks like it's not fair in this life, but if you could see all of our lives, we realize that the bad things that happen to us in this life happened because we did something bad in an earlier life, and the scales are just being balanced. And if we're good in this life, we'll get a better reincarnation. So it actually has a stabilizing effect on society. It encourages people to behave themselves, be nice to each other. Even if they can get away with it in this life, it will come back to them in another life. This is the same sort of thing we get in Christianity and Islam and in Judaism, when we get this idea of a better resurrection. Only in this case, it's a better rebirth. So this is this idea of cosmic karma. And then there's this idea of liberation. And this is that it is possible to escape, and desirable to escape the rebirth of samsara by becoming one with the universe. So they have a belief that, and I'm probably slaughtering this, so feel free to speak up if I do this wrong, but there's this belief that samsara is the rebirth in an illusion of separateness from the rest of the universe. And so to escape is to recognize that we are actually part of and connected to everything, interconnected with everything. And when we give up our illusion as a separate self, our rebirth stops. Not that we cease to exist so much as we join the universe that we artificially separated ourselves from in the first place. Or sometimes it's, in their case, becoming one with God, or Brahman. There's also a list of deities. I don't really list that under the beliefs because it varies. Depending on which Hindu you talk to, you'll have a different list of gods, you'll have a different list of myths and legends. And Hinduism has kind of emerged into a consensus in our day, but it originated much like Egyptian religion with a bunch of city-states, each one with their own set of deities. And as they interacted with each other and grew into larger collectives, they had to reconcile their different myths. And so they came up with ways to reconcile, like, my God is the same as your God, just a different name, and we'll combine the myths and create one super myth out of him, and my God is different from your God, but your God is this, your God is the God of this, and my God is the God of this, and those are all different ways of reconciling the different deities until you get something of a consensus today. But again, that consensus is built out of conflicting parts that have all just kind of been scooped together and put into a unity. In fact, I, as a Mormon missionary, I tried my best to teach in Hindu. It was really fun. I only met one on my mission, but he wanted to learn, so I tried to teach him. It was fascinating to teach him because everything I'd say to him, he'd be like, "Yo, that's great." Right? Book of Mormon? Yeah. Joseph Smith? Yeah. Jesus Christ? Yeah. God? Yeah. Oh, and by the way, Shiva is pretty cool too. And so is Brahman. And he started telling me about his... these myths are incompatible, and it was almost like nothing was possibly incompatible. There was a way to make it all work, and he just put it all together and take everything he could from everybody he could, and that's actually something that drove me nuts when I was, this black and white. This is the truth. You're wrong, right? And now I think it's kind of cool. Right? I like this idea of being able to just make it all work and take what's good from everybody and give up what's bad from everybody and make something else neat, right? And they're masters at this. At least the ones I've met are just really good at this. So practices involve ritual and worship. They actually have devotional worship to deities and rituals designed to worship those deities. And then they also have the practice of meditation. That's not a universal Hindu tradition, is my understanding, but especially their monks who are seeking liberation will focus on meditation. Their meditation differs, as I understand. My understanding of Hindu meditation is based on reading what the Buddhists say about what's wrong with Hindu meditation. So that's not really fair, but that's really all I know about it. And my understanding is their meditation is focused on this idea of extreme concentration, which creates a very, very powerful sense of ecstasy. And that's what it's about. So you enter the state of ecstasy, and that state of ecstasy is interpreted by them as this temporary glimpse of what it's like to be unified with Brahman. And the more powerfully you can have that, and the more repeatedly you can have that, then you can find liberation for your eternal soul in its union with Brahman. Through repeated entrances into this very powerful state of concentration. And of course that will differ from Buddhist meditation, and that Buddhist meditation will back off of the concentration a little bit and add this extra idea of, not extra, but they will emphasize mindfulness a little bit more to the lessening of concentration, to the adding of mindfulness. We'll talk about that in Buddhism. So there's the practices, and then they have this object of human pursuit, which I just love. It's the neatest thing in the world. I think it's great. 4 elements. There's the Dharma, which in Buddhism means the teachings of the Buddha, as I understand it, the teachings that help you become enlightened. when I looked it up for the Hindu use of the term, it talked about the moral values and righteousness and moral living, which I'm sure is connected in some way that I don't fully understand yet. But this is the idea of, these is the laws of moral living. So the purpose of life is to live a moral life so that you can have good karma. Then there's this, the artha, which is, and we should all be prosperous. Right? So there's none of this idea that you have to be poor and you have to, that wealth and prosperity and living a happy life, but not in a selfish way. Everybody else should be prosperous too, but prosperity itself is a value of life. It's not that you go around seeking wealth all your life, but there is this feeling that wealth isn't bad, seeking wealth isn't bad, as long as you don't, harm your neighbor on the way. And prosperity is something to enjoy. We should enjoy life and enjoy prosperity. And then there's this kama, and this is pleasure. Sensual pleasure, sexual pleasure, physical pleasure. And I think the best description of this that I've heard isn't from a Hindu tradition, it's from a Jewish tradition. But there was a rabbi whose name just escaped me. He's a modern rabbi that I was listening to, quoting an ancient rabbi. It's how it typically works, right? And he said, there's a Jewish tradition that when you die and you stand before the bar of God, you'll have to give an account to God of every pleasure you denied yourself. maybe, can you tell me where that comes from, David?
I certainly know the story. I don't know the origin.
So
the line is that the Almighty will say, I created this for your pleasure. Why did you spurn it?
Exactly. Okay. So I like that. I mean, maybe I'm just a bit of a heathen, but I think that's cool, right? And if you compare that to the Puritan idea that we just need to spurn all the pleasures so that we can get close to God. Well, if God created the pleasures to be enjoyed, by spurning those pleasures, you're spurning God, and that's the opposite of the point. And so this idea that God wants us to enjoy pleasures in life is, again, something that I find attractive. However, there is a tension that is intentional and seen as almost an eternal war in Hinduism, as I see it anyway, between this kama and moksha. And I don't know if I just said that right, but moksha is this idea of liberation. This is our spiritual values. And liberation comes, so now we're going to go the other direction. Liberation comes by relinquishing our attachment to worldly pleasure. Right? Because as long as I'm attached to worldly pleasure, I'll continue down the cycle of rebirth and rebirth and rebirth. But when I let it all go, I find a deeper joy in my detachment from the physical pleasures of the world. And these two are in intentional conflict. And so, the good life is the life lived where you seek prosperity, wealth, pleasure, but you do so without attachment to those things, an unhealthy attachment to those things that might cause you to become selfish, petty, right? And you put those two ideas together and you find the purpose in life is to navigate the path between those wealth, pleasure, and karma laws, being nice to other people, and letting it all go. And you got to do it all at once, even though it's contradictory. And that's the purpose of life, is to work your way down through those. Again, I find the entire worldview extraordinarily moving. So when we do meditation, remember I said it's the purpose of Hindu meditation is to achieve this very powerful ecstatic state of concentration. And you do that by absorption. So you pick something, and they're actually, as a group, called mandalas, but they're otherwise known as just the focuses. What are you going to focus your meditation on? So I could look at my candle here, and I could focus my mind on the candle. And if you don't mind becoming philosophical for just a second, all that really exists, the external reality may be there, but I don't know that. I mean, I think you exist. I hope you do. But all I experience is my conscious experience of something that looks like. So all that really exists for me happens in here. Out here is just an illusion my mind has created in here. And I hope it's created that external reality in response to external stimuli. But I don't actually know that. fact, that was one of the points that they've tried really hard to convey in this idea of the matrix, right? If you're plugged in, you're getting stimulation to your brain from a simulation instead of from reality. How would you tell? Because your reality is happening in here. And where do you know that the stimulation is coming from an external reality and not from a simulation or some other source? Or could you be making it all up yourself? It's an idea called solipsism in philosophy. So when I absorb my concentration, my consciousness, on a single object, have you ever heard this kind of idea when you tell rock climbers, be the mountain? It's kind of a cheesy, new age sort of be the mountain. But what they're trying to say is if you fill your consciousness with one thing, all you are is your consciousness. So for that moment, you are that thing that you have filled your consciousness with. And the irony is, maybe not the irony, but the intriguing point of all this is it feels that way. So people who actually do this talk about being the flame. They concentrate on the flame till they are the flame, till the flame is all they are, and they are the flame. Christians do this too. And I've become really fascinated with, I found several books on Christian monastic mysticism and meditation. And I read through them, and they sound an awful lot like Buddhist meditation. Except their object of concentration is usually an icon, a statue of the deity, or just the thought of God, or it can be a repeated phrase. Lord God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. Lord God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. And you fill your concentration with that thought until you are absorbed into that and you become that. And when a Hindu does that, they feel like they become one with the universe, they've joined Brahman. But when a Christian does that, if he starts with this concept of an external deity, and the external deity is the focus of his meditation, when he achieves absorption into it, he feels like he's just touched God. So, from my perspective, and this says nothing about, I don't make any claims about theological points. I don't know whether there's a God. I'm not going to tell you what to believe about God. But there's at least a psychological explanation for some of the things these Christians describe. So I'm reading their description of the state, and it sounds exactly like a Buddhist or a Hindu description of concentration, of extreme concentration, except they're interpreting what they just experienced a little differently because they had a different focus. So these are the list of kind of traditional Hindu and Buddhist focuses. The yantra, the tools for meditation. There's the mudra, and so this is an external. You've seen the Hindu, I can't do this, right? But they have these dance gestures, and we have yoga with these poses. But in each case, there's this idea. One of the very simple Buddhist meditation tools is if you want to know what it's like to be aware of something, you take your hand and you just move it, right? And you're aware of the position of your hand. This is the sort of awareness we want to create in mindfulness. We want to know where my hand is, know that it's moving, and be aware of the movement. So there's this dance, movement, and you meditate through movement, or these signs, these external hand gestures. And I find this fascinating when it moves into Freemasonry. They have signs, and there's these sacred hand gestures that show up in Freemasonry. They show up in Mormonism, and here they show up in Hindu and Buddhist meditation techniques. And the point is to concentrate on the sacred hand gesture. Then there's the sacred thought or sound. This is, Lord God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. This is Om. But you have a sacred syllable, a sacred sound, a sacred word that is repeated, or a sacred name of a deity, or something that you repeat, and you absorb yourself into that thought. And then there's this artistic picture. The most famous of them are called the mandalas. And we'll show you many pictures of mandalas. In fact, the temple itself is a 3D mandala, which we'll show you in a minute. And so this is the really powerful and difficult meditation technique. So the mandala is a sacred picture. I can draw a really simple picture, and I can ask you to hold that picture without distraction in your mind for a great amount of time. And you could maybe do it if it was really simple for a few seconds, and then you'll lose it. I promise. That's the way it works. And then you try again. But that's a simple picture. Well, if you get really good at this, then I'll make the picture more complicated. And if you get good at that, I'll make the picture even more complicated. And you've got to hold that entire complicated picture in your mind And we'll keep adding to it and making it more and more complex until you just can't do it anymore. And then the point of growing in your practice is to be able to add more and more and more to your picture. The picture is this, we call this man with a sacred circle. It's almost always a depiction of a square and a circle. Today is Pi Day. No, I'm going to do that in a minute when I show you a picture of a mandala. That's easier to do. So we'll talk about Pi Day. Today, tomorrow is Pi Day. And then there's the Tantra or the Loom. This is these magic rituals that you do. So there's sacred rituals. And I don't actually know as much about the Hindu rituals, but in other traditions this would be the sacrifice, this sort of thing. But there's the sacred rituals, and we'll show you a couple of the Hindu versions. So there's the ritual, there's the picture, there's the syllable, and there's the hand gesture. And each of these can become a focus for meditation. Here's a mandala. This one is a combination of the triangle and the circle, so it doesn't really give us the circle and the square. I'll show you a different one when we do the circle and the square. Yeah, well, here it is. There's the square. Okay, let's do the circle and the square. All right. Again, this is one of those things that just shows up everywhere. So the symbol of Freemasonry is the compass and the square. And what do you use a compass for? Making circles. And what do you use the square for? Making squares. This shows up on Mormon Mormon veils, and Mormon garments, sacred clothing, and this shows up in. There's actually, I'll show you some pictures of some Chinese Taoist pictures of the deities holding aloft compasses and squares, and etc. But usually the square represents the earth, and the circle represents the heavens, the movement of the stars around the heavens. And so to put them together is one of the tasks. There's a sacred element to this in Pythagoras. So we go all the way back to the Pythagoreans. One of the sacred tasks that you could set somebody was called to square the circle. Does anyone know what it means to square the circle? Yeah.
Find a square of equal area to a circle.
And to define that with some sort of rational mathematical formula.
Yes.
Yeah.
Geometry.
Well, to construct it with
to construct it with a square and a compass, or to create a technique for doing so, or a mathematical representation that is based on a rational number that lets you equate the area of the square to the circle, depending on how you want to do it. And why can't you do that? Because pi is an irrational number, so there is no rational equation that will equate the area of a square to the area of a circle, because the conversion involves pi, and pi is an irrational number, meaning pi is an infinite series of digits. And so the Pythagoreans, my understanding, and I think this is a little bit of in doubt, because they kept their secrets so well we don't actually know what they were. But the Pythagoreans had a secret that they would tell their initiates as part of their initiation ritual, and we're almost positive that secret involved either the proof that the square root of 2 is an irrational number, or the proof that pi is an irrational number. We don't actually know, I think, which it was.
But they have a proof for pi?
I think so. Or either that or the square root of 2, but I think it's pi.
Square root of 2 is trivial.
Well,
pi
for you. For you, it's trivial.
No, I mean, we did it in ninth grade algebra. It's really easy.
So, well, it's easy to understand the proof. It's not hard. It's hard to construct the proof or realize it.
Yeah,
So,
for the first time.
Yeah, the first person that comes up with that is a fairly brilliant person. So it may have been the square root of 2 that they proved, but I think it probably was because they continued working on squaring the circle for a while.
I don't think pi was proven to be irrational until the 19th century. Actually,
that's entirely possible. So, well, they also might have had a proof that was wrong. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right? So, but for them, that proof of irrationality of a number means something, right? That's infinity, the Ein Sof, the without end, the infinite. And so it's a proof that there is something that is without end out there. And they're seeking, just like I said, seeking the center of a circle. Here they're seeking the infinite in the matching of the square circle. Well, here they're just doing a little different. They're trying to combine the heavens and the earth, which is, again, part of what squaring the circle is about. It's trying to combine the heavens. This is sacred geometry. So we've got a square. You have a circle. What is this? Anyone know?
One of the 4 entrances.
Yeah, so those T-shapes will show up later when I start showing you temple pictures. those are the entrances to the temple. So the temple gates are of that shape. So the first thing you realize, if temple gates are like this, the first thing you realize is this is a temple. So that's the first realization. The mandala is a temple, and the temple is a three-dimensional mandala that depicts the world, the universe, through the square earth and the round heavens and the cosmic mountain. That's the round moment. But what do we have here? Around the outside edge, what is that a picture of? Those little...
A circle.
Yeah, it's a circle. What are these?
Scallops.
Scallops. What? John?
Answers?
Arches.
Are they petals?
Yeah. To what kind of plant?
From the lotus?
Lotus. So what's the meaning of the lotus? I don't know. I keep wanting you guys to answer these questions because you know this better than I do. So even today, if you read Thich Nhat Hanh, he'll use the lotus and the flower as an example. It's one of his favorite examples of this idea. Does anyone know what the lotus represents?
Well, it's a beautiful flower that emerges from mud.
That's right. It grows out of the mud. That's exactly the meaning of it, and where the meaning is derived. Right. It grows out of the mud. So when we use the lotus, it's this representation of purity growing out of impurity. And so there's this idea that when flowers die, they decay. It's really sad that flowers die. My son constantly asks God to make the flowers last forever, that we get his mom, right? He wants them to not die. And they always die. Right? And what happens to them after they die? Well, you throw them in the compost heap and you make good compost out of them, which is this ucky mud, and you put the mud out and up grows another flower. So you can obviously see reincarnation in that, you can see rebirth, but you can also just see the cycle of life. But there's this idea of the pure flower growing out of the impurity, and this is like our mind. The mud is like our suffering, and the flower is like the awakening that grows out of the mud of our own suffering, if we allow it to. So that the flower, the lotus has all of those kind of depictions to it. But then we have this. This is two triangles, one pointing up, one pointing down, and then they've mixed the colors up. And red and white. Why do you think red and white? In this particular. Now, no two of these are the same. Like we go through one of them, and the next one will be completely different. But what's going on with the red and the white?
Red is blood, white is spirit.
Close. The blood is right. How about
Purity.
what?
Purity.
Purity.
Heavens.
There's all sorts of things you can do with white and red, isn't there? In this case, though, what they were trying to represent is the union of the masculine and the feminine. So we're gonna get a little bit more direct with it, right? So the blood is not just blood; it's menstrual flow, and the white is not just white impurity; it's semen. And so the moment of creation grows out of the sacred center, which grows through a union of the masculine and the feminine. If you remember our Brahmin priest, that was the lingam and yoni that he was drawing in the sand. The union of the masculine and feminine that marked the sacred center. And so they've repeated that idea, but they've done it with triangles pointing up and down, being locked in union with the masculine and the feminine components. So, and then around it, of course, we've got our Hindu deities. You can use this, I think this is for Tantra, I think, where they I'm not sure. I think they try to decide that the self is an illusion by taking upon themselves the alternate selves of the various deities, and they see how they're actually connected, I think. So here's our first Hindu temple, and this is where I start slaughtering names. Let me see if I can read this. Kaliya Sanath, Lord of Mount Kalias. That's an epitaph for Shiva, so this is a Hindu temple to Shiva. It's in India, in a place called Ellora, India. It's built by King Krishna I in AD 760 to 780, and an estimated 400,000 tons of rock were removed to expose the temple. So the temple wasn't built, it was carved by taking the non-temple rock out. So you notice the mountain here? This is the mountain, and then they carved the temple out of the mountain. These are really impressive buildings, aren't they? When I start talking about some of these beautiful buildings and the work that they put into it. The spire or sakha indicates the most holy chamber below. So the holiest place is down here, and you can tell where it is from outside because they have this spire on top, which of course has phallic imagery. You've got to have that if it's a holy temple, right? And below is the most sacred center, but that's the womb chamber where Shiva and his consort were worshipped. The hall to the right, the mandapa, is surmounted by 3 circular lotus flowers and 4 lions that guard the 4 corners of the world. So here's our lotus flowers in 3 circles, and there's our lions that guard the 4 corners of the world, and there is the sacred center. And this is a square with a circle, with concentric circles, with the sacred center, with guardians at the 4 corners, and gates here, 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 and here. So what is it? It's a mandala, carved out of the rock in 3 dimensions. This is actually a modern Hindu temple, actually still in use, which is kind of nice because it gives you an idea of what these things would have looked like. The old ones I'll show you don't look like this anymore, but they would have looked like this. And by this I mean painted. So this is Gopura. And these are the Gopura gateways of the great temple at Madura, India. Since this temple is very popular, the carvings have been repeatedly plastered and replaced and painted. The eyes are brightly colored. Bright colors are the sign of life. The result can be rather garish to Western eyes. I'll show you a close-up of the paintings. But remember, that's very cultural. We find this kind of mishmash of colors very garish, and they found it a beautiful symbol of life. It's the sort of colors you would just never be able to see in nature. So it's super nature in its color and beauty. In the foreground under the roof is a large pool for ritual bathing. I believe that's in here, this roof building. And what you're actually seeing, it's tempting to see this is the temple, right? But what you're actually seeing is a mandala. And at the 4 edges, there are 3 gates at each of the 4 edges, and someone's actually standing at one of the gates, I believe, looking down at the other. So this is actually a big square, and there would have been these 3, I think, at all 4 of the corners, or all 4 of the edges. And if I kind of zoom in on this, you'll notice that every square inch of this thing is covered in one statue or another. It's just filled with statues and carvings. And those statues and carvings are very, very, very brightly painted. This is again a depiction of the 16-armed Vishnu destroying one of the many demonic forces in their scriptures from the great temple at Madura. And they're all that detailed. And if you go back now, you can imagine that sort of detail in kind of each of these points. You get an idea of exactly what you're looking at here. It's very busy, and it's very intricately carved. This is from Angkor Wat, which is actually a Buddhist temple, but it's a Buddhist temple that Buddhism is to Hinduism, this is a really bad analogy, as Christianity is to Judaism, but maybe that's the best analogy we can make. The Buddha was a Hindu before he became the first Buddhist, and so Buddhism doesn't require that you worship any deities, but you can, and the deities often worshipped in Buddhist temples are often Hindu deities. So this is a Buddhist temple with a Hindu deity. So it's a Hindu Buddhist temple. But this is from Angkor Wat, again, the Buddhist, but it's a good depiction of what would happen in a Hindu temple, which is why I used it, even though it was originated by the Buddhists. And what we have is, again, this is the lingam yoni, which is the same thing that Brahmin priest was molding out of the sand. It's the phallic and female imagery put together in a dark, small, enclosed room at the very back of the temple. So if you remember that picture of approaching the sacred center? In this case, you go down a long corridor to that sacred point at the back. When you get there, you're in this dark, dark, enclosed room with this phallic symbol. Some people like their temples brightly lit. especially so again, an example would be a Mormon temple where you move from darkness into that point of light. And the lights go up as you move into brighter and brighter rooms until you get to the most sacred spot, which is brightly lit. In this Hindu temple, you go from a brightly lit room to a dark room. And again, sensibilities, it can be a little bit garish. It can be a little bit jarring. Not garish, jarring in its ungarishness, right? To our sensibilities. No light, dark, dank. Why is this a sacred plant? And can't they even put lights in here? The realization of what it depicts, though, I think kind of wakes you up from that kind of slumber. What we have is the moment of creation. Not the moment of creation of a person or the conception of a human. So it's not just a sexual image that represents the conception of a human. This is the birth of the universe. This is that moment of creation when the universe began. This is the Big Bang. And so, in the beginning, it was tohu vavohu, empty and void, desolate, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And you're in that moment of darkness when light is about to burst forth through the conception of the universe, as depicted by William and Yoni. And so what that room is the womb. And it's dark because it's the womb. And the light is going to burst forth from this dark space. And so as you go back to that moment of darkness because that's the sacred moment. And that sacred moment was a dark moment, not a light moment. So you go back before light to this moment of conception and darkness. And that is the sacred point, the womb. So here's a depiction of one of the rituals that they actually performed in this place. This is a royal Brahmin priest pours a libation of ghee or clarified butter over the lingam, a symbol of Shiva, and the yoni, while a Khmer king kneels reverently. The liquid would run off the channel and seep into the ground, ensuring fertility. So what's the liquid representing? It's a fertility symbol, but this is the semen, yeah. And it seeps upon the ground through the channel and it ensures fertility. The ceremony, which took place in the innermost holy of holies of the royal temple complex, confirmed the divine kingship and ensured the continuity of the empire and the fertility and prosperity of the empire. The spout always pointed towards the south. Here's another depiction. This one's from National Geographic. The same ritual. Again, with the deity in the back, the womb, and the pouring of the milk. So this is, how do you say this? Khajuraho? Who knows how to say it? Khajuraho? It's a group of monuments, and it's a group of Hindu and Jain temples, apparently together. The Jains and the Hindu got together and they built this set of temples. There's Jain temples and Hindu temples all next to each other in this complex in Mahadura, Pradesh, India, about 175 kilometers southwest of Jhansi. They're one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in India. The temples are famous for their Nagara-style architecture symbolism and their erotic sculptures. So I want you to just look at the carving here. These aren't statues in this particular case, but these are very deeply carved. And I'll show you a picture, a close-up of one of these in a little bit. These are very deeply carved blocks of stone. And it's very hard to carve in really deep channels in the stone. This is extraordinarily complicated and beautiful stuff. And intricate. Right? Very intricately flowery carved. And then around, I believe at this level, I got that wrong over here maybe, you get statues of people. Very, very finely carved, things that rival the sort of thing that Michelangelo would do. They're very beautiful, in a different style though, very beautiful carved statues of individuals. About 10% of them are erotic. The rest just depict love, etc. But the 10% that are erotic get all the photography. Right? Western people walk by and we don't see that sort of thing on the streets in America, so they take a picture. So if you ever look up this temple, you'll find those first in a Google image search. Don't do a Google image search for this temple at work. For that reason. Here you go. So here's the statues of the various people, and then up here is this very, very deeply carved geometric patterns. This is inside. Again, there's people, depictions of people here, and the hallway is set up for circumambulation. There's a ritual practice around the sacred center, which again you can see the sacred center here, and then inside there's a place for circumambulation. And then there's this sacred spot in the center. So this is the sacred center underneath. You can circumambulate around it this way. And this is what I mean by just the deep carving of the geometric patterns. And then here's the statues of the people, and very finely carved. They would have been painted like the other statues we saw earlier, but the painting is gone. This is a depiction of the four-armed Vishnu. This is temple dancers or celestial maidens. The one on the right apparently is admiring herself in a mirror. And you're starting to get the idea, right, of there's a sensual quality to these statues. This is a lady stifling a yawn or sneezing. This is Vishnu, his second from the left, flanked by celestial maidens, and amorous Maithuna couple, and a woman admiring herself in a mirror, shielded by a seven-headed cobra. And then some of them you look at and you wonder if what they're depicting is even physically possible. And what I want to say about this is it's really easy, again, to get what I call the Western giggles. You know, something related to sex, and we don't talk about sex very much, so we freak out. Only 10% of the statues are erotic like this, and this temple is a bit unique. I don't think you see this sort of erotic sculpture everywhere you go in temples. But if you remember back to our 4 principles, right? One of the purposes of life is to enjoy physical and even sensual pleasure, and that then has to be balanced with dharma living, where you don't hurt other people in how you do this, and relinquishment, so you don't become attached to it in a way that causes you and others suffering. So you experience pleasure and you don't become attached to it at once. And again, this is a very different approach to human sexuality than what we find in the West, based on Puritan sort of principles and ideals. I think a much more healthy view of what human sexuality is about. So that's kind of all I've got for Hindu. I've got a chunk for Buddhist next. I'm going to take a drink. Does anyone need to take a 5-minute break? And then we'll come back and do Buddhism.